I have for you today one of these subjects that really makes me wonder why more Western types don't consider Straussianism. So, last week there was a Telegraph report titled, University Students Demand Philosophers Such as Plato and Kant Are Removed from Syllabus Because They Are White. When you read the article, and we will look at some of it, you will see that they want to decolonize the university. Now, everyone else on YouTube and in the media is mocking this story, but not here at the Solid Quarry of Relatively Sober Reason. For me, it's game on. I'm going to explain to you how Leo Strauss attempted to decolonize the university. Strauss was trying to do it before it was cool. Much of this article is just indignant comments from people that don't really take the colonial charge seriously. I do take it seriously, and I will explain why in a moment. But first, let's pick out the relevant parts of this article. The article says, the student union at the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, insists that when studying philosophy, the majority of philosophers on our courses should be from Africa and Asia. So, first of all, philosophy is a Greek word, or rather it's two Greek words. It seems to me that if we are going to decolonize our thought, then we shouldn't assign Western categories to other parts of the world. Is it correct to call Confucius a philosopher, or does that miss something? Can we answer that question without comparing him to Socrates? Anyway, some more from the article. The Union said it is part of a wider campaign to decolonize the university as it seeks to address the structural and epistemological legacy of colonialism. The Student Union at SOAS, a leading center for the study of Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, stated that decolonizing the university and confronting the white institution is one of its priorities for the next academic year. It said that white philosophers should be studied only if required, adding that their work should be taught solely from a critical standpoint. For example, acknowledging the colonial context in which so-called Enlightenment philosophers wrote within, it added. Alright, so I'm going to end with that since it is where they compromise and name their terms for studying so-called white philosophers. I call them Western philosophers, but here they are right. All thought should be studied from a critical as well as a sympathetic standpoint. This is especially true for Enlightenment thought. An easy way to understand why is to consider a fine line from Karl Marx. The ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. In the course of studying, it simply has to be considered whether Enlightenment thought and post-Renaissance thought generally was merely a rationalization of the interests of the ruling class. Notably, the bourgeois needed a justification to keep all their property, and so they came up with the idea of rights. Rights are a bourgeois rationalization concocted to discredit feudal society and justify their rule, and the language of rights was just preserved by the socialists when it came time for their revolutions. And the idea of rights was based on the state of nature theory. And if you want to know why I think the state of nature isn't really serious, you can watch my video, Why Do You Think People Have Rights, Bro? But that isn't the end of the issue. We can't throw out Western philosophy just because the Enlightenment is a rationalization of the ruling class. What came before the Enlightenment? One of Strauss's great insights is that to whatever extent classical or ancient philosophy came to rule, it certainly did not originate with a ruling class. It was the thought of poets that ruled ancient societies, especially in the case of Athens. To get to the point, the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle couldn't merely have been a rationalization of the interests of the ruling class because their philosophies were not the ruling ideas. Their society was ruled especially by the ideas of Homer and Hesiod. In fact, Athens tried to destroy philosophy in the person of Socrates. 2 generations later, After the fall of Macedon, Aristotle fled Athens saying, "I won't let Athens sin against philosophy twice." So you can get all that from Strauss, and what we are discussing is Strauss's distinction between ancient and modern, and it can nearly be taken as pre- and post-colonial. Of course, ancient societies were more or less colonial everywhere, including Europe, but I am talking about the colonial impulse that we have inherited. I am talking about the colonial impulse that quickly conquered the world and ushered in modernity. The impulse that can be traced to, among other things, Columbus crossing the Atlantic in 1492. It doesn't seem like a small matter that Machiavelli's The Prince debuted only 20 years later in 1513. It is Machiavelli that Strauss concludes represents the break with ancient thought. Machiavelli pretty much expresses this himself in The Prince. In The Prince, he wrote that, "Since my intention is to write something useful for anyone who understands it, it seemed more suitable to me to search after the effectual truth of the matter rather than its imagined one." And many writers have imagined for themselves republics and principalities that have never been seen nor known to exist in reality. For there is such a gap between how one lives and how one ought to live that anyone who abandons what is done for what ought to be done learns his ruin rather than his preservation. And then, most of the Enlightenment thought that followed Machiavelli similarly focused on defining justice so that it can be achieved in this world, whereas in classical philosophy, justice is essentially problematic. I have noted before that far from being especially noble, focusing on rights, like the Enlightenment does, actually focuses on the least noble aspects of justice. It focuses on the minimum standards for justice. But ancient writings consider minimum standards too, and minimum standards are not all of the standards. One more thing I want to mention is that we all remember that chick in South Africa suggesting that we decolonize science, but that isn't really serious. The issue is what knowledge we can have of how to live well. For example, Aristotle got gravity completely wrong, but if we could explain to him how gravity really works, he would say, "Oh, that's interesting." And it wouldn't necessarily affect any of his other views since science wasn't central to his philosophy. So I think you get the gist of it, and it's game on. It's on like Platon or Xenophon or George Washington or Abraham Lincoln. Let's decolonize the university. Let's decolonize social science. I'm going to suggest Plato and Aristotle. It seems to me as though they are the most important commentators. I have recently read several books on China, and the whole time I was thinking, well, what would Plato and Aristotle think about this or that? Watch my video, the one I mentioned earlier, "Why do you think people have rights, bro?" to get an idea of just how different their pre-modern perspective was. That's right. Decolonize means pre-rights. Rights originated, like I said, as a rationalization of bourgeois class interests. Without the Enlightenment, we just call them rules or laws or minimum standards of justice. And next time you meet a virtue signaling, Western hating SJW saying that we should decolonize the universities, call their bluff and say, "You're right. Enlightenment philosophy is just a rationalization of bourgeois class interests. We should decolonize the university. We really need to get some Plato and Aristotle up in here." And then soak in the look of more or less bewildered contempt as they stand there trying not to realize that they haven't thought the issue through.